The historical practices associated with the Annales School are a standard part of most historiography and historical methods courses, where students learn how the movement grew out of the 1929 journal Annales, largely in response to the dominant inclination at the time to write political history. In my graduate work, done completely through a distance learning model, such a course was not required or even offered. This provided a unique opportunity to independently develop my own understanding of the movement solely through my interpretation of the print record. This situation led me to ask basic questions others may not have raised and to find unconventional methods to answer these questions, which I borrowed from outside the historical discipline itself, specifically from sociology and information and library sciences. In reading through the vast literature associated with the Annales School, I focused on intellectual exchange between U.S. scholars and analysts. I encountered a strand of powerful figurative language depicting these French historians as a tidal wave of invading scholars. This piqued my attention. I imagined troops of scholars transported across the Atlantic by Air France. I wondered how U.S. scholars responded to this invasion of French academics. Were they welcomed as guest speakers on U.S. campuses? Were they hired into the very positions sought after by U.S. scholars? I wanted to know if this somewhat paranoid, figurative language pointed to larger trends, or if it was just the voice of a few isolated academics. I chose my research methods carefully. None of the Annales authors or their monographs were familiar to me. I am not fluent in French, which prevented the pursuit of my inquiry into those texts. I was limited to those available in English. Could I use this to my advantage? The list of scholars associated with the Annales seemed endless. On which authors should I focus? Among them, which of their works attracted attention in U.S. academia? There exists a surprising strand of scholarship written outside the historical discipline, which models the application of Annales methodology to those disciplines, and is largely ignored by historians themselves. Is history indifferent to its neighboring disciplines? In the first issue of the journal, the founding editors pointedly and specifically stated their goal of promoting multidisciplinary research. Why then are accounts about the movement so divided, not only between disciplines, but also within history's kaleidoscope of subdisciplinary specializations? My first task was to identify a set of scholars and their works to illuminate the contours of U.S. Franco intellectual exchange. The Annales Journal has been in continuous publication for more than 9 decades. Using Per Se, an online open access digital library whose holdings focus on French scholarly journals, I counted the authors who had contributed to the journal from its founding in 1929 to the library's ceiling in 2002, and found 3,149 authors. This was overwhelming. But I had noticed most authors listed wrote less than 10 articles. If I set my minimum at 10, this reduced my list to 250 scholars. I was curious about the range of productivity among them. Resorting my sample, seen in slide 1, I found most authors contributed the fewest articles, between 10 and 19. With each additional set of 10 articles, there were fewer authors. I was puzzled by the 8 most productive authors to the far right. While 3 are central figures in the movement, half of these most productive contributors are rarely, if ever, mentioned in the literature related to the Annales. In addition, the limitation of 10 articles had eliminated several key figures seen in slide 2. The outliers in this data led me to conclude that journal contribution is inadequate for measuring prominence of Annales scholarship. Because of the large numbers involved, I borrowed from sociology, specifically the work of Nicholas and Carolyn Mullins, Theories and Theory Groups in Contemporary American Sociology, 1973. The Mullinses were interested in tracing how a set of ideas developed over time in a group of scholars by analyzing institutional affiliations. They examined the development of clusters where a given scholar reaches such prominence as to draw students to his or her institution in order to study in a mentor-student relationship. I anticipated finding evidence of clusters at certain universities surrounding an interest in Annales scholarship and methodology. Setting the 250 Annalists aside for the moment, I worked on establishing a list of U.S. scholars who wrote about or referenced Annales in their publications. I generously included scholars appearing in the literature related to discussion about Annales, with the intention of gaining a comprehensive sense of the wider academic culture in which my subject of inquiry operates. Therefore, you may notice a name or two in my slides that does not seem to belong. These inclusions provided a broad set of scholars from disciplines outside of history, including archaeology, economics, sociology, literature, geography, folklore, philosophy, pediatrics, sinology, and thanatology. Appropriating from sociology allowed for an analysis of scholars from a very wide range of disciplines. Would this show evidence of cluster formation? To identify institutional affiliations using the Mullinses model, I scoured university websites for curriculum vitae and mined the literature for reference to affiliations. The working hypothesis was that clusters may have formed at specific Annales-friendly institutions, which I predicted was more likely at sites where Annalists traveled for guest speaking or teaching assignments. Tracing Annalist academic travel was challenging due to the disinclination of French scholars to post their CVs on university websites and my inability to read their non-translated memoirs and interviews. This problem aside, I identified 1,316 total affiliations. When counting affiliations, I differentiated between undergraduate and graduate students, grouped all the teaching positions together, and then separated emeritus. This allowed me to clearly see student versus teacher, practicing versus retired. The sociological model placed a minimum of 5 affiliations needed to form a cluster, with at least one teacher and several students. After eliminating institutions without the 5 prerequisite affiliations, I had 19 universities where a possible cluster may have formed, shown in slide 3. The affiliations at these sites ranged from as few as 7 to as many as 79 on slide 3. The overarching premise is that the greater number of scholarly affiliations at an institution increases the likelihood of cluster formation around an interest in Annales scholarship. Slide 4 shows the 19 universities disaggregated by student to faculty, and now eliminating New School, Northwestern, and UC Irvine, all with no students. Despite the wealth of data collected, I had unfortunately disproved my own theory. There was no evidence of clusters, even with large numbers of affiliations, as seen at Harvard, Princeton, and Berkeley. The sociological method was particular for dealing with large sets of data: 250 scholars, 1,326 affiliations, 19 universities, analyzed for patterns over nearly 100 years. My research to this point focused on scholars and their affiliations, but I still did not understand how Annales scholarship was received by Anglophone scholars, who wrote about them from multiple disciplines. I moved on to the print record. One traditional approach for the study of intellectual exchange is to perform a close reading of a selection of monographs, but this would not work for my purposes, with too many scholars and an exponential amount of published works. Who works with published works more than librarians? It was to the information and library sciences that I turned for a methodology I could use to navigate through the print record. I returned to the 250 annalists with 10 or more journal articles and identified which of their monographs were written in English or available in translation. I found French scholars are much more inclined to work collaboratively with a co-author or even a team than are US scholars. I decided to simplify my focus to single-authored works. This reduced my data set to 50 monographs. Although still a large number for analysis, I was not reading them, but measuring their prominence within US academia. Since I was engaged in distance learning, I started with the tools available from home. WorldCat Identities is a service maintained by the Online Computer Library Center, which provides the world's largest network of library content. Although WorldCat Identities does not allow for the use of delimiting criteria, it has outstanding benefits. It shows a scholar's total number of works, worldwide library holdings, the number of languages in which the works are available, and the number of editions. Each of these contributes to understanding a scholar's impact. The higher the numbers, the greater the impact. Slide 5 depicts total works in all publications. I found that authors with fewer works and higher library holdings are likely to have high impact because of reproduction in journals, compilations, and as chapters in other books. Also, libraries often have multiple holdings of a single work. These factors increase the impact of the work. Likewise, the more languages an author's works are available in also indicates broader interest, shown in slide 6. These data points helped me gain a sense of the prominence of the monographs to a worldwide audience, to which I later compared my target group of US scholars. I was curious how the prominence found with WorldCat in total works, holdings, and languages measured against 2 US authored reference books, which featured heavily in my initial research. Annales Historiography and Theory, a selective and annotated bibliography, Jean-Pierre Arubel, 1994, and French Historians, 1900 to 2000, New Historical Writing in 20th Century France, Philip Dayleader and Philip Whalen, editors, 2010. Arubel's work is directly aligned with my interest in Annales scholarship, whereas Dayleader and Whalen focused only on French historians. I scanned both books to see which scholars the authors chose to include and which annalist works are listed or discussed, charting my findings alongside the data collected from WorldCat. Frustrated that their publication date and focus left the last 20 to 25 years not covered, I sought another means of measuring academic prominence and found the Gale Contemporary Online Database. Gale is a subscription service commonly available at university libraries. Gale provides biographical and bibliographical entries on modern authors, which I hoped would be more up to date. Gale has a tendency to include the most prominent authors, so I added Gale to my chart. My findings showed remarkable consistency in authors mentioned and works included between these data sources. However, when this data is compared in slide 7 to the number of articles in the Annales, it is clear that publication in the journal cannot be used as a single measure of prominence for an annalist. In slide 7. The method just described is not standard in bibliometric analysis, but it is an easy way to get a sense of prominence for authors and their works. It does not require any specialized knowledge or skill, just internet access, and for Gale, a library with a subscription. What these tools could not provide was data specific to the US, which is what I most wanted to measure. To achieve a deeper study, I performed a citation analysis using multiple tools and measurements with a bibliometric methodology borrowed from library science. At home, I utilized Google Scholar. And before you dismiss this tool, consider a 2016 study by Anne-Will Harzing and Satu Alakangis, which found that Google Scholar has stable and broad coverage over time and is quite useful as a source for bibliometric data, especially when used comparatively with additional subscription databases like Scopus or Web of Science. Web of Science is more reliable from an academic point of view, but has several drawbacks. It is difficult to use, even for trained librarians, and the indices upon which the citations are based have significant voids in their coverage. The Social Sciences Index is the most comprehensive, covering 1900 to present, but the Arts and Humanities Index only goes back to 1975, and the Book Citation Index covers from 2005 to present. Google Scholar and Web of Science show consistent agreement in the top 50 monographs, earning the highest citations. A small portion are shown in slide 8. But there are significant differences between these two tools, particularly in the area of excluded monographs with 0 citations, shown in slide 9. Here is an example of 7 monographs with citations in Web of Science, but not Google Scholar. Conversely, when resorted for highest citations in Google Scholar, slide 10, an entirely different set of authors and monographs appear. Consider the 1972 translation of Brauddel's The Mediterranean, which is most cited in Google Scholar, but not prominent in Web of Science, because 2 of the 3 indices used do not cover 1972. The strength of Web of Science lays in the variety of options for delimiting criteria. Researchers are able to select citations by year, by country of origin, by language, and other options I did not use, by journal, discipline, and university. The methodologies I borrowed from other disciplines were extremely useful for identifying trends over 9 decades involving large numbers of both scholars and their works. From sociology, I traced scholarly affiliations to universities. Although I found no evidence of cluster formation related to an interest in Annales scholarship, I did accumulate a wealth of data to build upon for future analysis. There is much to be learned about the shifting of scholars from site to site and the influence possible relationships have on their scholarship. Bibliometric analysis, borrowed from information and library sciences, allowed me to perform a detailed study of publishing patterns, showing which authors and monographs gained attention through the citation behavior of other scholars. While WorldCat identities in Google Scholar are accessible, they do not allow for delimiting search results. Web of Science is a robust and precise tool, but requires subscription access and is difficult to use even for professional librarians. Given the focus of this panel, I have shared with you a concise description of my research with emphasis on the methodologies borrowed from outside the historical discipline, rather than providing a rich account of my results and conclusions. The methods briefly described here are quite useful for gaining clarity in understanding how scholars interact with each other at universities and in the print record, across disciplinary boundaries, and over 9 decades. I hope that what I have modeled here today will be taken up by others as well, to further illuminate scholarly interactions so that we can better understand the development of the historical profession. Thank you.